Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Roundtable. I'm Sonia Baxendale, President and CEO of the Global Risk Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion on the potential formation of a Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. Please note that today's event is being recorded, so interested parties may listen to the discussion at a later date. Although this event is virtual and many of you are joining us from across Canada, I would like to acknowledge that the GRI is headquartered in Toronto, which is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. The evolution of reporting standards is occurring in response to the changing risks and opportunities in today's economy, and driven in part by the increasingly diverse stakeholder needs that comes with it. We're operating in a complex and fast-changing socioeconomic context through the long tail of the pandemic, rife with uncertainty about key economic conditions such as inflation, geopolitical factors, and interest rates. All of this is happening against the backdrop of climate change and the fundamental restructuring of the energy systems that power our lives as we transition to a low-carbon economy. We are here today because the Independent Review Committee on Standard Setting in Canada is currently seeking your feedback on our review of how Canadian accounting, auditing, and assurance standards are established and what might be needed for sustainability standards. It is important that our financial reporting reflect a more three-dimensional story of the business risks and opportunities we face than traditional financial reporting sometimes allows. And our shareholders and important stakeholders are making their expectations clear on the sort of information they would like to see. As lenders, investors, and underwriters, we are users of reports from our clients, our counterparties, and our portfolio firms. We increasingly need this information to inform our business decisions and to know if we are meeting our ambitious targets around important issues like diversity and inclusion and the net zero portfolio emissions. Reporting and disclosure is the only way that we can know if we are doing the work to thrive and survive in these changing conditions, and that they have the low carbon transition on their radar, or that they are well governed, and a myriad of other strategic aspects that have not historically been captured within traditional financial reporting. As a committee, we have made broad stakeholder input a priority. We are hoping to hear from as wide a constituency as possible to ensure that our recommendations reflect the views of our community. Participating on the committee and hosting all of you today for a discussion is central to what GRI does. We aim to work with regulators and industry participants to help support financial system stability and tackle the key issues facing us. Today, we are extremely pleased to welcome the chair of the review committee, Edward Waitzer. Ed, many of you know, has had a distinguished career as a lawyer, professor, and advisor on governance and public policy matters. Ed will share more about the committee's work and recommendations with a focus on the proposal for a Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. From there, we will open it up to discussions and questions from you. The intent of today is to have a two-way dialogue and maybe even a little healthy debate. Joining us today will also be Alison Slater, my colleague and Senior Director of Sustainable Finance at GRI, and she will be moderating this segment. We will also have Stephanie Fox, who is the Senior Vice President of Standards for Financial Reporting and Assurance Standards Canada, and is an observer to the Independent Review Committee on Standard Setting, participating in the discussion. So with that, thank you, Ed, and let's turn it over to you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sonia, and thank you even more for being a participant on the committee. It's a very diverse committee, a very discussed. So it's been on so far. Then it's provide context for what the committee has been asked to do and how we've approached our task. And as Sonia pointed out, there are two tracks. One stream that feeds into what we're doing is simply the fact that the standard setting process for financial reporting and assurance services hasn't been reviewed for almost a quarter of a century. I date myself by the fact that I was on the last task force. So part of this, as you'll see in the consultation paper, is sort of going back and looking at what might be called traditional issues around independence and legal structure, funding, relevance and responsiveness of standards within the existing context. The second, and probably the one we'll spend more time on today, is a recognition that sustainability and, by implication, extended external reporting beyond traditional financial metrics are rapidly overtaking traditional financial reporting and assurance metrics and standard and services. And these issues and standards are more complex. They engage a much broader range of stakeholders. The CPA profession doesn't have the same statutory franchise as it does with respect to financial reporting and assurance services as a result of securities laws, for instance, designating the use of generally accepted accounting and auditing principles. Having said that, CPA Canada is familiar with setting standards and applying standards that are used by non-CPA members, so there's some precedent for what we're doing. They're also different in that that a lot of these standards focus on systemic issues. So they are both firm focus, which has always been the focus of financial reporting and metrics, but also there's this systemic level concern, and the process for developing sustainability standards will probably differ from the process by which traditional financial reporting and assurance standards have evolved. So a big set of issues. There are a bunch of peripheral issues that we address in the report that I'm happy to speak to, but probably of less concern, so I won't deal with them at the outset. In terms of the approach we took to the report, we tried to be, we did a couple of things. We benchmarked what's going on elsewhere in the world. We tried to be relatively agnostic, but to identify what we saw as some of the key issues and invite comment. We deviated from that on two sets of issues. One is we did take a normative view as a committee on the merits of creating separate infrastructure for sustainability standard setting, as opposed to folding that into the existing infrastructure. And happy to discuss why. Some of that's articulated in the consultation paper, but we thought better to put our view out there as a way of provoking a more robust discussion. And then the other set of issues that we took a bit of a normative view on are really contextual, but we felt it wasn't appropriate to talk about issues like the public interest or diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the special legal rights afforded to Indigenous and Francophone, for instance, communities in Canada, without articulating our view of how to approach those issues. So we tried to do so, again, thinking that would better provoke a more robust consultation process and feedback. And as Sonia said, given the range of stakeholders here, we have tried to be and are trying to be proactive in engaging as broadly as possible. We actually, to give you an example, another one of the committee members is Paul Rochon, who, as most of you know, was Deputy Minister of Finance for until recently, and through him we went to folks in finance who organize pre-budget consultations and got advice from them as to how to engage proactively in outreach. We're doing webinars. We've got a micro website. We are open to feedback, both written but also sort of one-on-one meetings or group meetings. We aren't wedded to, while this session is being recorded, we are very open to having discussions that don't have to be recorded so that we get the broadest range of input possible. Why don't I pause there, and I suspect we'll cover a lot of ground that I might have spoken to in sort of discussion, and that'll certainly be more useful for Sonia and Stephanie and me. Allison?
Oh, thank you so much, Ed and Sonia, for setting the stage. We would really like this to be more of a discussion and a sharing of views. And although it's hard to see on this platform, present today are peers from across the GRI membership base. So this will be banking, pensions, insurance companies, financial crowns, and even some of our partners from financial regulatory and government agencies. So you're among friends. There are two ways you can join in the conversation. One is to just type your thoughts or your questions directly into the chat. Direct them to all panelists. I'll monitor and elevate as many of those as possible. But the second way is simply to click on the raise hand icon on the bottom right hand side of your screen. You'll find that going in through the more options section in the bottom right hand side if you can find it. Raise hand. Once we see a raised hand, we'll actually just move you right in here and into the room and on stage with us, and you can unmute, turn on your video, and just join in the conversation and ask your question. I'll call on you when I see you come in. So in the meantime, as you get your questions ready, as you're typing, as you're finding the raise hand, why don't I kick us off a little bit? Maybe first a question of clarification, because I know a lot of us on the call today don't come from the accounting community. You said we thought we need separate infrastructure for sustainability rather than folding it into the existing infrastructure here in Canada. How would the CSSB relate to existing, say, accounting infrastructure in communities, and how would it relate? Maybe it's a two-pronged question, and how would it relate to authorities such as the CSA, which we've all been following now? They've put out a proposal for a national instrument on climate-related financial risk reporting, which seems aligned with what the ISSB is doing internationally as well. So how would a CSSB sort of fit into this busy space?
Great question, and you're going to take me out onto thin ice, I can tell very quickly here, Allison. So let me answer the question in the reverse way, or respond to the question in the reverse order that you raised it, which is, and these are personal views, so happy to kind of engage on any of it. But my sense is, let me put it this way. Historically, regulators have not been anxious to be standard setters when it comes to reporting standards. That's certainly the case with financial reporting and assurance standards. where they basically licensed the profession, and not just in Canada. With respect to sustainability, I suspect the same is true, but that regulators have been responding to demand and public expectations in the absence of a convergence towards some kind of generally recognized standards to try to accelerate the process. So my guess is that if we get to some reasonable degree of convergence, and the Task Force on Climate Disclosure was a big step, the International Sustainability Standards Board is obviously another big step. Regulators like the CSA will be happy to hand off. I may be wrong on that, but that's my guess. In terms of parallel structure, you currently have, and Stephanie can sort of articulate better than I can the current overall structure, but we have separate standard setting streams and then oversight bodies that in effect impose oversight discipline on those standard setting streams. The Task Force on Standard Setting 25 years ago suggested that it might make sense to separate all of that into a different legal structure to achieve sort of separate legal and optical separation from CPA Canada, what was then CICA. That was the one substantive recommendation of that task force that wasn't adopted. Most of the world, not all of the world, has moved in that direction, that is towards legal separation. We can debate how much of this is perception and how much of it makes a substantive difference, but if I were betting, I would bet that we will move towards legal separation. The question then becomes, do we house sustainability standard setting within the existing standard setting body and oversight bodies, or do we create a separate Canadian Sustainability Standards Board and oversight body in parallel to what we already have with respect to accounting and assurance and auditing? And our view is there's considerable merit in and the incremental costs of creating a separate Canadian board, which would interact with the International Sustainability Standards Board, much like the existing Canadian boards interact with the international standard setters, is more than cost justified in terms of being able to influence the overall standard setting process, being able to be responsive to unique Canadian concerns, and being able to address standard setting for a range of audiences that goes beyond public companies or reporting issuers. So we're thinking about sustainability standard setting for private companies, not-for-profits, public sector entities as well. And those are some of the reasons, and we can get into that discussion.
Alison, maybe I'll just add, just sort of punctuate a couple of points, because I think it's important, and Ed did touch on this, but there's almost two things happening here. And one I would sort of put into the category of, the existing standards need to be reviewed and updated and challenged as part of good hygiene. And that's sort of the first piece that Ed's describing. And in my view, the biggest part of that is stakeholder expectations have continued to evolve. And so that's what I think the committee has tried to focus on there when you look at some of the recommendations. And then the second is, globally, there is this demand for us to address sustainability. And there are varying degrees of views as to how unique Canada is or isn't, but I think at a minimum, we need to specifically be able to address those areas that are critical to our industry, to our financial sectors. And so, you know, how one does that, and just given the importance of this, I, for one, don't think that we should make cost our biggest issue. What we should make a big issue is ability to respond quickly, our ability to, you know, our timeliness around decision making, because I think one of the, rightly or wrongly, one of the criticisms around this sort of standard setting is how long it takes to make change, you know, at an international level and then at a country level. So I think that's really what I would personally put as the bigger question and the bigger challenge in terms of the structure we set up and its ability to respond in this space in a timely manner.
I'm going to add one more comment. This is, you're now seeing why this committee has been so much fun, because I love working with Sonia. It's like riffing. But you know, the financial sector is uniquely positioned in all of this. You know, the accounting profession starts with a franchise that they take for granted, and you know, they have to decide where they want to play on this much larger playing field. And you know, there's an inherent conservatism that you would expect in, I think, any organized group, and I don't say that critically, nor is it a comment on Stephanie. The financial sector is uniquely positioned to address the system level concerns, if I can put it that way. You know, or the whole nature of corporate law, and I'm now going to sound like an academic, is focusing on the firm. You know, directors have an obligation to act in the best interests of the company. Financial reporting is all firm related. Sustainability very quickly gets beyond that. And the financial sector kind of gets that just because that's what you do as intermediaries. You are assessing risk not only on a firm level basis, but on a systems wide basis. So that's why this kind of discussion is so important for us.
Thank you. I mean, so many of the issues have already come out just in this short exchange. So I just want to encourage everyone, if you'd like to join in, feel free to join us on stage here. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a little arrow and the word participants. Click on that. That'll open up. And at the bottom of that screen, you will see the hand function. I know a lot of people are having a hard time trying to find where is that little raise hand. It's open participants. You'll see the drop down on the bottom right-hand side of that window. You'll see the hand function. In the meantime, we've had a couple of questions come through, and I think this is another sort of another level set. What would be the relationship between the CSSB and the proposed sort of separate legal entity and standard setting as proposed in your question 7? Maybe you've hit on that a little bit. I guess it would be a separate legal entity, and maybe you could talk a little bit about, you know, what's the vision, or what are your questions to us about how it could be governed and the sort of skill set that you might need, you know, to fill a CSSB.
So on the legal structure side, the model at the international level and in many other parts of the world is to have a standard setting board that is a separate legal structure with separate funding from the accounting profession. And so one of the issues is, do we want to go in that direction? The separate legal structure is relatively simple. Separate funding becomes a bit more complicated. You know, right now, standard setting is the funding model for standard setting is a member pay model. we've explored we are exploring other models. I can tell you that Paul Rochon has told us that moving to a public expenditure model where government funds this is a non-starter. And to be honest, we can think of a bunch of reasons why, even if it wasn't a non-starter, it wouldn't make sense in terms of the integrity of standard setting processes. The other broad model, if I can put it that way, is a user pay model where you figure out how those who use standards or other products that are generated as a result of standard setting pay for the use of those standards or services, and that's one way or another the costs end up flowing back to users, but in different ways. And as Sonia points out, in the big picture, the costs are relatively insignificant. I think we worked out that the existing standard setting infrastructure costs CPA members about $64 a member. And the incremental costs, I forget what our number is, but $14 or something like that, 12 or... It seems insignificant when you look at it from, on a call like this. It won't surprise you that many in the profession, including leadership in the profession, say, we're very focused on costs and we're very worried about incremental costs. So that's the funding side. The last part of it, Allison, that you raised was the competencies, and we clearly recognize that for sustainability standards, we need to bring in a much broader range of competencies than and views, diversity of views, than is the case for financial reporting. And there are a whole bunch of issues within that. For example, the existing standard setting bodies are populated by volunteers, and then those volunteers are supported by staff housed within CPA Canada. There's some merit to having volunteer membership on a standard setting body. We can move the staff support from CPA Canada to somewhere else, or we can leave it in CPA Canada. There's a range of choices there, but the threshold issue is the issue isn't kind of what kind of competencies are required. I think everybody will agree on that. It's where those competencies are housed and the extent to which this is a staff-driven exercise or a volunteer-driven exercise. So those are some of the issues we're thinking about.
Just building on what Sonia said about timeliness, although this has been a long time coming, maybe this sort of sustainability standards have been under development through these voluntary frameworks for over 2 decades, but I think it sort of hit capital markets, and the demand is there and is very real and is urgent now. And so on the one hand, we have that. On the other hand, the question is, is it too early to form a CSSB? Should we wait till the ISSB gets itself set up and running, and we've seen at least the first standards, sort of before we figure out what we should build, rather than just automatically mirror what we see on the accounting side? Should we take a wait and see approach?
Well, part of the answer to that is, let me describe our timeline, which is we're out in consultations till the end of March. Effectively, we'll be engaged in consultations probably longer. And our mandate is to report out with actionable recommendations sometime this summer. So is it too early? This is a dynamic situation, but I suspect that, and I wasn't involved in the timing, but I suspect part of the timing was the fact that we knew ISSB was being constituted, a preliminary set of standards were being handed off. The EU is working on their taxonomy. The SEC is about to put out their initial standards. The CSA is kind of moved from spin cycle to saying we're going to go ahead with some standards on climate. So it seemed like a timely thing to kind of put an oar in the water, and given the level of visibility as to how things are likely to evolve over the next 5 years or so. So I suspect that's the view, and that would be my view. I would say delaying this effort would put Canada at a disadvantage at this stage.
Yeah, I think I would agree with all of that. The only other comment that I would add is that we shouldn't forget that we also have this federal government effort around the Sustainable Finance Action Council or Advisory Council. I can't remember. We have one and they have one. I can't remember what it's called, but that are dealing with some of these issues. And we've, of course, been coordinated with them as well. But I do think the timing is right, both internationally and within Canada, to get ahead of this as much as we can.
Yeah, just one more factual point, Allison, that goes to a question you asked earlier. We have representatives from the CSA, OSFI, and CPAB at senior levels on attending as observers on the committee, and the term observers is one of form, not of substance, which in other words, they have been fully engaged in the discussion, and they haven't been cut out of it at all. So there's a pretty strong line into the regulators at this stage.
That was exactly what I was going to ask, is are you getting that sort of level of cooperation with the patchwork? Because I think one of the strengths of a CSSB could be to help bring that together and form that umbrella we need so that we have that sort of consistent, sort of standardized approach, no matter what jurisdiction your entity falls under, that you'd have those similar reporting requirements coming down. So just
from your lips to God's ears.
It's easier said than done, I know that. Just to say, we've opened up some polling because people are being a bit shy on the participation side to join us on stage. So, but please feel free to take part in the poll. We may have a few more questions to come. First one is up there, just to get your first thoughts on whether or not we're in need of a CSSB. I'll move to some of the participant questions here. One of them is this one always comes up. What about the cost and the burden of reporting on organizations? So right now it's been voluntary, or if for those issuers, if an issue has been determined to be financially material, they would have had to provide information on it. But mostly this has fallen into the realm of voluntary uptake, and so therefore lots and lots of entities have not really made much progress on ESG reporting, sort of broadly speaking. What were the committee's discussions around that sort of cost, capability, and that space in terms of sort of, if this goes mandatory, how do we balance the pushback we might get, especially from smaller firms on that?
So let me provide a couple of perspectives. One is part of the reason for that we think a separate Canadian board is appropriate is to address the different needs to better address in a more nuanced way the different needs of private issuers or private companies, public reporting issuers, not-for-profits, and part of that calculus is cost burden relative to benefit. The other, and this may be a bit more controversial, is I think I can make an argument that accelerating convergence on generally agreed upon standards and a process for doing that has integrity in terms of kind of being whole and complete will actually reduce costs from an overall perspective. Right now you've got this sort of multiplicity of standards and reporting that kind of diminish the utility of information both at a firm level and a systemic level. B, and maybe more importantly, you've got entities reporting based on all these different standards, and exposing themselves, I think, in a very real way to potential liability. And having a little more discipline on the process will mitigate that risk, which sort of is a tail cost, but it's a cost you don't see until it hits you, and it's beginning to hit. And yeah, maybe that's my lawyer's perspective, but I see that happening literally every day.
Yeah.
Maybe I could just add one quick. So absolutely agree. We need to, this shouldn't be additive in terms of the reporting. This should be consolidating reporting. But I think the other factor is we're already seeing even with the organizations that have initially said, okay, well, we're going to hit net zero by 2050. The accountants are starting to say, okay, show me your plan, show me your evidence, show me how your proof around this. And so it's going to come at us no matter what. And so, you know, it's better to be proactive, shape it the way that we would like to shape it, and try to manage those costs, manage the efficiency, and manage how it gets done. Because I don't think it's going to happen in some manner, mandatory reporting on these things. And it's just too big a driver, and stakeholders are already demanding it. So I would say it's here, like the demand is already here for this.
And what would be the sort of ability of a CSSB to, you know, influence the international standard settings, the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board? If we take a page out of the book of what's happening on the accounting side now, if we assume sort of the mechanisms are similar, would we be able to bring that Canadian perspective to the international table, or are we just sort of small beans here?
Yeah, and like I may be Pollyannish, and I was involved. I actually chaired a committee that structured the IASB years ago, and I scratched my head wondering why I was asked to do it, but realized very quickly that sort of Canada occupies a unique role between Europe and the United States. And we are so highly integrated with the US from an economic point of view, but from a cultural point of view, we are perceived as independent of, and in many ways more aligned to Europe. And so Canada was able to play as it does sometimes in peacekeeping and stuff like that, a bridging role. So that's one influence. The other obvious influence, which I think Canada has had in the international accounting and assurance side, is bringing the unique perspective of, you know, the Canadian economy, which is you know, a highly resource-based economy, a unique political system, likely unique views on Indigenous perspectives that it can contribute. There are a bunch of things where Canada has particular credibility, and by having a separate board, certainly on the accounting and auditing side, has been able to has been more credible.
Alison, maybe if I can just add something to that, just to build on what Ed has said. I think part of the reason is, and one of the things we do differently in Canada in adopting international standards, is that focus on influence. Many countries literally take the standards and photocopy them, kind of thing, whereas we do go through much more effort to sort of make an assessment of them, deal with Canadian stakeholders, engage with them to try to assess the appropriateness for Canada. And we do that from the beginning of the standard setting process, so that influence is throughout the process, and then as opposed to coming in at the end. And I think that has proven, to Ed's point, to be successful. And so we already have a very strong relationship, as an example, with the International Accounting Standards Board and with the IFRS trustees. And so I think that being able to build on that is quite natural in terms of a relationship and an ability to influence on the ISSB side.
Sort of talking about that two-way street. So Canada taking the international standards and remaining aligned, but making sure they're relevant for our economy and our unique attributes, and vice versa, bringing our lessons learned back and being able to be a part of that global conversation, and as you say, a bridge maker between big economies. So that sounds important. There's a couple of questions here coming through from Chris, and it's, I'm not sure if the standard setting function will be able to answer, but let's see. He's talking about, should we revisit the concept, I think, if I'm paraphrasing incorrectly, Chris, clarify for me, revisit the concept of profit reporting. So this idea of B corporations, that you're contributing to a sustainable future, you're contributing to the way you operate, and your products and services are solving problems. There's more than just profit that maybe could come through on that bottom line. Is this the sort of thing that the standard setting would the CSSB would look at, or you sort of leave that for the standard, the CSSB itself to tackle, or were there those sorts of conversations and considerations in the committee?
So our committee isn't looking at substantive standards. We know that the first sets of standards are going to be climate related and diversity related. There are separate work streams that I'm aware of within CPA Canada that are kind of beginning to look more broadly at traditional financial reporting and thinking about it in terms of value reporting in a broader context. So yeah, all of this converges, right? The whole debate about corporate purpose, the injection of sustainability into sort of governance discussions, and the fact that our corporate law has now shifted to a stakeholder primacy model. How we get there, and whether B corporations are part of the answer is not something that the committee is looking at, but providing a framework for standard setting is our focus.
Yeah. There's another question I think I could take on, which is what's a concrete example of a typical sustainability standard? What would it encompass? And here I think we could look at the sort of the value chain of standards as they're coming down, with the ISSB talking about using the so-called TCFD, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as the starting point for developing, as a first pass, climate-related reporting, and that they would broaden that out and cover other sustainability topics, of which there are dozens, everywhere, everything from human rights to gender diversity to other environmental, let's say, water indicators and things like that. So it's all about these typically environment and social topics, trying to convert those into performance indicators, impact indicators, or reporting that helps the company or the entity talk about how those issues are affecting their business. So I hope that sort of answers the question. I think the CSSB, I suppose, would, at least in theory, be aligned with the ISSB, sort of starting with climate and expanding from there. You'd mentioned earlier about important issues in Canada, such as Indigenous rights, that we might not be important issues in other countries just due to their different national circumstance, but here issues like that are. Is that about right? Are those the sorts of topics we're talking about in terms of what is a concrete example of a sustainability standard?
Allison, you're the expert on this panel because you've been at this for longer than any of us. So and for sure those are already on the table, and for sure there will be more to come.
I'll just add from a very practical perspective, the working group that's I guess the precursor to the ISSB did actually issue what they called the prototype standard. I mean, this is getting quite to a practical level. They issued a prototype last November, so you can certainly look at that. And we do know that they are saying still that exposure drafts of those prototypes, and possibly changed a little bit for the initial standards, will be issued at the end of March. So you may have the answer very soon about what, practically speaking, the first set of standards will look like.
Stephanie, could you maybe let people know where they could access that? I'm not sure everybody on this call would know.
Yeah, the easiest way is probably to go to the website for the IFRS trustees. I can probably pop it into the chat if that helps, to be able to go to participants. Probably the easiest way, because the board hasn't been formed yet, is to go to the website for the IFRS trustees and then just probably do a search for the prototype standard. I think it'll come up quickly, but I'll find the link and pop it into the chat if that's helpful.
Terrific. Thanks, Stephanie.
The other bit of good news.
Allison, there's a question on the screen. It will take 1 minute, but from Chris Chopik about Paul Martin talking about genuine progress indicators and where this is going and where Canada should be moving away, whether Canada should be moving away from GDP. And again, it's not a question of whether. The federal government has dedicated massive resources to working on what it calls a well-being index. They've also had in place for a number of years a gender-based reporting system that all budget submissions have to go through before they land at finance. And all of that is public, so you can read these gender-based analyses. So they're well along. As I said at the outset, our thinking is that, as is the case with financial reporting and assurance standards, sustainability standards should be broadly applicable to all sectors. So in some ways, this effort may be taking some of that, introducing a more impartial level of accountability into public sector accounting. And obviously the standards will be different, but part of the question is who should be setting those standards.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we're here today. I think some of the concerns from industries, from the financial sector, is again the continuing patchwork, and are we going to get out ahead? So if we sort of voluntarily follow the ISSB in our reporting, but yet the CSSB is not yet formed, and the relationship with CSA is not yet there, and are we getting out ahead? Should we wait and see? I guess, what if companies move out ahead of the formation of a CSSB? Just so your thoughts there, and I would bring your attention, everybody, participants, to the polling where we asked that question as well. Maybe back to your confidence in something like a CSSB to be able to bring more harmony to both the various different authorities, but also the timing on this, so that we're sort of moving more in concert and lockstep rather than this patchwork. So again, the question is around, did the committee have a view if companies move ahead of the CSSB efforts? Would that be a positive or a negative thing? And for participants to take a look at the poll.
Yeah, I don't think of it as positive or negative. I just think of it as reality. It's kind of like what Sonia said earlier, which is most public companies are already reporting on sustainability in one way or another. Why? Because they are responding to stakeholder expectations. And it will be easier to do so as standards converge and some integrity around the reporting and assurance processes is built out. But I think, again, the train has left the station, which goes back to why this is probably timely. normalizing things, if I can put it that way, or building some integrity around it will probably be a public good. It'll be good for everybody.
Yeah. Just looking at the poll, and I didn't get the chance to discuss the other one that was up, which was, do we need a CSSB? The majority said yes, but there was second place was wait and see, and there were a couple of votes for no. So although people seem to be aligned with your pitch, there were some questions still in the middle. So for those who did vote for wait and see or not so sure, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free again to come in and express your views or load your thoughts into the chat. Right now, we're looking at a question on how confident would you be for a CSSB to bring that alignment and harmonization for standard setting, and we're getting some fairly confidence. So that's 4 out of 5, kind of out in the lead, somewhat confident, which is a 3 out of 5. But we do have still a number of votes in the lower side, say slightly confident. So still some people who are concerned that the CSSB wouldn't be able to bring that harmonization that we're seeking. Again, please put in the chat your concerns, your specific thoughts, concerns, ideas. What do you think would hold it back? What would need to happen to make this more, for it to reach its objectives of really bringing that level of harmony?
May I speak to that one for just 1 minute? Because one of the issues we raised in the consultation paper is, how do we make sure standards are responsive and relevant and timely? And the financial sector bears the scars of standards that have taken a long time and have been very costly in application. Having said that, there's at least an argument that sometimes you want to be slow on standard setting, so it's not all speed. And we've thought about, and I'm throwing this out just because we'd welcome input. We've thought about intermediate kinds of instruments. So if it's going to take time to develop a standard, are there ways we can bridge by putting out guidance or interim standards? So it would be very useful to have input from users on those issues of timeliness, relevance, responsiveness of standard setting.
So feel free to do that in either here or, of course, there is a public consultation open right now. You can go to the website and respond through a letter if you have some thoughts. I know the committee would appreciate that.
Well, yeah, a letter, a phone call,
yep,
a request for a meeting, and it's not just Stephanie and Allison and me. All of the committee members have basically indicated they're completely accessible. So, we had a webinar yesterday with a group of a mostly corporate group from Alberta that was mediated or moderated by a committee member who's a retired audit partner out in Calgary. So feel free to contact anybody.
So thank you for that open invitation. Maybe a last question as we come close to the top of the hour around auditing and assurance. So as would the CSSB sort of also be a part of not only reporting standards, but setting assurance and auditing standards? And would there be a mandatory requirement for assurance and auditing of sustainability data or reports?
So the answer is we're looking at assurance standards as well as auditing standards. And again, the same challenge, both the challenge that sustainability standards are very different in nature than financial reporting, and that the providers, the service providers, are a much broader range of service providers that extend well beyond the accounting profession, both on reporting services and assurance services. Whether it becomes mandatory or not, interesting question. I would have thought the answer will be market driven, which, and again, it goes back to liability concerns and just, if I'm a director, I want to have some assurance as to the quality of the disclosure that the company or entity is putting out before it goes out there, because I'm going to be held accountable for it. And assurance is the way of getting there.
If I could, I would bring your attention to one last poll, which is, how you feel would the CSSB be able to influence the ISSB, the international standard setting. So feel free to submit your thoughts on that one as a last round, and we'll provide the polling results to the committee so you can sort of see where this group felt and where they landed. I mean, maybe if I could sneak in one last question as we 5 minutes up to the top of the hour, and I'm sorry I keep dominating, so feel free to again raise your hand or put your last question in into the chat. Has the committee talked about the importance of that sort of materiality determination as a part of standard setting? Right now, in the voluntary standard setting, is sort of the first step is determine what's material and then report on it, and that process in and of itself is sort of left to the company and doesn't have a lot of standards behind it. I don't know, had there been any thoughts and discussion on that concept of materiality and sustainability standards?
We have talked about it. I'm not sure that's specifically within our remit. It goes more to kind of how standards are going to, whoever's going to develop the standards, how they're going to think about it. I guess my observation would be, again, the market is redefining materiality simply because of the disclosures that are going out there right now, and the fact that you've got a plaintiff's bar that will hold issuers accountable for their disclosure, and courts, in a whole bunch of cases, are saying if you've said it, that at least gets you through all the preliminary motions to a trial, and there haven't been that many trials yet, as to whether you should be held accountable for it. So, I think the notion that materiality is narrowly focused on financial issues or even short-term market impacts is probably an issue that kind of has been overtaken by events, which isn't unusual for the law, right? The law kind of is often a lagging indicator.
Well, thanks for addressing that. There's so many complexities in this sustainability standards space, and it is I think really nice to see it maturing and moving towards this level of professionalism and officialdom. With that, why don't I hand back to you, Sonia, for some final
Thank
thoughts.
you, Allison. And Ed, I know that you're retired now from the legal profession, but I'm sure that there will be lots and lots of work on determining all the aspects of this. So first of all, let me please thank you, Ed, not just for participating here today, but for your leadership on this matter. It's a very important issue for Canadians, and so thank you for leading it. Stephanie, thanks for participating and for all of your work involved in getting us to this stage. And Allison, thanks for moderating and keeping us on time today. And to our participants, we greatly appreciate your questions, your responding to the polls, and your engagement on this.